Hello, my name is Matt, but you may know me as the Tattoo Robot. Today, I've got another fantastic drawing tutorial for you. This is part of a series where I'll be illustrating 3 cocktails, each in a unique tattoo style. Traditional, neo-traditional, and my personal favorite, Nu Skool. So, sharpen those pencils, or charge up your Apple Pencil, and let's dive in. First things first, let's draw the base of our glass. A simple circle will do the trick. Now, some of you might be thinking, that's not a circle, it's an oval or an oblong. Well, you're wrong. It is a circle, it's just drawn in perspective. Now let's add the top of our glass and the sides. For this example, the top of the glass is the same size circle as the base, and 2 straight lines connect them to form a cylinder. If I erase this bottom line, it looks like a very basic non-transparent cup. But we're not stopping there. Let's push it further. If I add a half circle or even a full circle to the top to represent the lip of the cup, then add an inner circle near the bottom and connect them at the edges, we've got an interior of the glass. Now it's starting to look like something a basic cocktail might be served in. But wait, it's empty. Oh no. Time to fill it up. Another circle will represent the surface of our beverage. Let's add some ice. To draw an ice cube, I'll start with 3 simple square shapes, then I'll refine them just a little bit by rounding out the edges. But you don't have to do it this way. For a traditional tattoo style, I might keep those edges sharp and clean. Now, let's add a bunch of these cubes to the glass, erasing where they overlap, since we're not worrying about transparency right now. Let's pretend this is the glass I'll use for my project. So, I'll add some line work and maybe a straw. How do you draw a straw, you ask? Same as before. Start with a cylinder, but use smaller circles and space them farther apart. Alright, now that we know how to draw a glass, let's try out some other types of glassware using the same method. But first, I'll add a handle to this example to turn it into a mug. To do that, I'll just draw another cylinder, but this time I'm adding a couple of bends to give it that classic handle shape. Here are 3 quick examples. For champagne flute, I'll start with a circle as the base, adding a thin cylinder for the stem, then placing another circle at the top. I'll connect the top to the stem with curves that are straighter near the top, that taper down and round out at the bottom. For a hurricane glass, it's the same concept as the champagne flute, but this time the stem is made up of multiple circles at different angles to give it that unique shape. Finally, a pint glass has gentle curves that taper slightly at the center. Now that we've got all this practice under our belts, let's move on to the full project. For this traditional cocktail drawing, I'm going to change the way I construct the glass. Traditional tattoos don't rely too much on depth or perspective, so I'm treating this more as a flat 2D image than something in 3D where you can actually see all the circles that are going into this. When constructing a piece of artwork, try to break it down into simple shapes. For my sketch here, I'm roughing in the shapes using rectangles based on a jar for reference. Once I'm happy with the overall shape, I'll add the handle, starting with another rectangle to get the size approximately right, and then refine it from there. If I were working at a different angle, I might use circles to establish all my shapes before refining further. It's important to get your base shapes down before diving into details. Not that this drawing is going to be all that detailed. That's not a bad looking jar. But I don't want this artwork to look boring, so I'm going to add a little lemon for garnish. Remember all those circles we practiced? Let's bring those back. For the lemon slice, I'm going to make 3 circles. One for the rind, the outer peel, one for the pith, the white inner layer, and one for the fruit. Then I'll split the fruit circle into segments, adding little curves to each segment to represent those juicy sections. And now let's add a flower. Pretty much the same as the lemon, but adding a little bump in the center of the petals and erasing the outermost circle. We'll add a couple of leaves and we've got ourselves a simple little flower to add a little bit more color to this piece. Now onto the beverage itself. We could do some ice cubes as I demonstrated in the basic section of the video, or maybe we could do an oceanic landscape. Maybe even a skull, who knows? I started this project when I was in South Carolina, so I decided to add a palm tree and a crescent moon as a tribute to their flag. But this is your artwork. You don't need to follow along with exactly what I'm doing. Bring in your own inspiration. Make it more you. Being a tattoo artist, I often ask my client for additional details about them so that I can incorporate that into the tattoo and make it more special. I had to move some elements around to make it all work, but now I'm happy with my sketch. Everything is presented clearly, and I've left enough space between these bold lines I'm about to add to squeeze in some color. Now, let's dive into the line work. I'm using a bold black line with a slight bleed, so it gives it the effect that it was done with a marker. Of course, what you use is up to you, but I like to make traditional artwork feel a little bit more rustic. Now that we've finished our line work, it's time to double check all the lines are touching. This is especially important to you Procreate users as it allows you to easily drag and drop colors. The same applies to Photoshop and the Paint Bucket tool. Coloring a traditional piece should be pretty straightforward, but artists are taught differently depending on where they're from and who's doing the teaching. When I first started tattooing, traditional tattoos weren't given the same respect that they receive today. They were seen as simple and underdeveloped, but then a resurgence happened, and suddenly the tradition was given back its rightful place in the name. It's where American tattooing began, and many artists wanted to get back to those roots. So I will share a little bit of how I learned, but just know that other artists may favor different methods. When I think of traditional tattooing, I think of a limited color palette. This stems from what was available back in the early days of tattooing. Colors were bold, basic, and practical. Mint, for example, wasn't an option back then, so it's best to avoid it if you're trying to stay true to that traditional style. There are a few approaches I use when coloring this type of artwork. One is edge to edge, ensuring everything is fully saturated for a bold, consistent look. Another is creating a gradient. This could transition from black to color, black to skin, black to color to skin, or just color out to skin, or in this instance, blank canvas. The gradient doesn't need to be smooth, it can appear peppery if that's the look you prefer. For this piece, I think a red background will nicely complement the yellow lemon and the blue flower. The bold contrast between these primary colors will help the design pop and give it that classic traditional tattoo feel. Some artists believe it's against the rules to use white in American traditional tattoos. But if a highlight improves the design, I'm all for breaking the rules. After all, it's art. Pushing boundaries is what makes it exciting. And there you have it, a traditional style sweet tea mule. As luck would have it, I have all the supplies to make one of these at home, so I think that's what I'll enjoy tonight while I prepare the next video in this series, the neo-traditional cocktail. I've got so many more drawing tutorials planned, each diving into the triple tattooing styles, so stay tuned for those. Did you follow along with my tutorial? If so, how did you change the artwork to make it your own? I'm on Instagram at TattooRobot. Tag me in your drawings. I'd love to see what you've created. Welcome back everyone to part 2 of the cocktail drawing tutorial series. This time we're diving into the neo-traditional style. Let's get started with the cup. As always, we're sticking with the basic rules of cocktail artwork. Start with a circle and turn that circle into a cylinder. For this piece, I'm going to be working with a rocks glass, thin walls, and a thicker weighted base. You may notice I've created a boundary to keep my artwork isolated within a specific space. This isn't something you need to do for practice, but it's a skill tattoo artists use constantly, so I felt that demonstrating it here would be important. We're often constrained by existing artwork, so it's important to adapt your designs to work within tight or oddly shaped spaces. There we go, a nice little glass. This is where I remind you this is your project. So make it your own. Add some ice cubes, a straw, maybe a sprig of mint or lavender. You could even throw in a slice of citrus. In the traditional video, I showed you how to draw a slice of lemon. This time, I'm using the same method, but I'm angling it towards the viewer because neo-traditional artwork allows for more depth. Have you thought about how to make this your own? Of course you have, because you're an artist. What colors are you planning on using? What's the base of your cocktail? Are you making something completely new or recreating your favorite drink? The possibilities are endless. For my cocktail, I'm drawing inspiration from a recent trip to Myrtle Beach, where I went to a nature preserve and watched this eastern great egret fishing near Cherry Grove. Incorporating it into my design felt like the perfect way to create a dynamic composition. If you're interested in drawing birds, I'll be breaking it down in the next set of tattoo style tutorials. For now, let's keep building this piece. To complement the egret, I'm adding a couple of decorative circles to the background, a nod to Art Nouveau, an art movement from the 1890s through World War II that heavily influenced early neo-traditional tattoo artists. Let's move on to the line work, but this time, let's push our creativity a little bit. For this piece, I'll be using some colored line work. Uh-oh! Some tattooers might call that illegal, but I think it's a great way to add depth, so I'm doing it. The colored lines I'm going to add will be thinner and in turquoise, creating a contrast against the thicker black lines of the foreground. This approach helps give the piece more dimension and visual interest. If you're a tattoo artist watching this, a quick heads up, don't dive into colored line work on skin unless you're confident in your technique. Colored pigment often has a thicker density than traditional lining ink, which can lead to some undesirable results. Alright, let's color this thing in. For my cocktail, since I stayed in the Cherry Grove area of Myrtle Beach, I wanted to go with a cherry cocktail. One of my clients who lives in the area recommended the Cherry Grove Hard Lemonade, a popular drink at a local bar. For contrast, I chose tangerine and mint as my hero colors, while keeping the rest of the artwork in shades of gray. Except for the egret's beak, of course. If I were tattooing this design, I'd use neutral grays, not gray wash. I didn't go into much detail with coloring the egret because this is a cocktail tutorial. If you want to learn more about drawing birds in the 3 tattoo styles, I'll be covering that in an upcoming tutorial series. Now let's focus on this drink. I'm darkening the surface of the liquid more than what's underneath. For the section beneath the surface, I'm using darker tones along the edges to create contrast against the egret's submerged leg, and this gives the drink a transparent look, as if light shining through it. Adding the circle at the bottom of the glass creates even more depth. To make the glass stand out from the egret, I've muted the drink's color with gray for a more subdued tone. And just like the red tones, I've brushed in darker from the edges to make the center appear almost illuminated. At this point, you could consider this piece complete. But let's go a bit beyond and enhance the highlights and reflections. While this might stretch what's typically seen in neo-traditional, modern technology gives us the ability to take things to new heights compared to when the style first emerged. To make the glass appear reflective, I add highlights that follow the shape of the glass, creating the illusion of light coming from multiple sources. On the other side of the glass, I enhance these highlights with a touch of black for contrast. I then gently erase parts of the highlights to soften the shine, letting the other layers peek through. If that feels too complicated, don't worry about it. Just focus on adding highlights where you think that they belong, especially along the rim of the glass. You could even make the surface of the liquid catch a highlight, or reflect something from above, such as your garnish. Since my beverage is carbonated, I'm adding some bubbles. I keep them simple. A red circle that I fill in with a gradient, dark on top, light on bottom, with a white highlight. I only make a few of them, and then to save time, I duplicate them and place them randomly around the beverage. I drop their opacity so they won't overpower the rest of the piece. These kinds of details are for the viewers that take a closer look and appreciate the effort that goes into artwork. And there you have it, the Cherry Grove Hard Lemonade. It's a delicious cocktail and almost as fun to drink as it is to draw. How did your artwork turn out? I'd love to see your creations. Are you going to try your hand at the other styles? In the next video, I'll walk you through how I created the Nu Skool Prickly Pear Margarita. Thanks for watching. It's time for the 3rd installment in this cocktail series. And today, we're working on my favorite tattoo style, Nu Skool. This approach is so much fun because it allows the artist to exaggerate the artwork. There aren't a whole lot of rules when it comes to Nu Skool. Ideally, you want variations in line width, thicker lines as parts get closer to the viewer and thinner as they recede into the background. I personally like to mix in some colored line work, but it's not necessary. And for parts that are even further in the distance, I might drop the line work altogether. But that's not what we're here for now, is it? Let's concentrate on a singular image, this cocktail. For this one, I decided on a stemless margarita glass. My initial sketch begins with some circles that I've turned into a cylinder. Sounds familiar, right? Once the size looks correct, I'm going to add a circle for the base and one for where that cylindrical portion meets the bowl-shaped upper portion. And let's not forget the walls of the glass. These lines essentially run parallel to their outer counterparts. However, this glass does get a little bit thicker as it gets towards the bottom, so I'm going to taper these lines towards the center ever so slightly. Now that I've got the shape of the glass the way that I want it, I'll start working on those customized details. Mine, of course, is going hand in hand with those other two cocktails in the series by carrying along that Myrtle Beach theme. But you can do whatever you want with this artwork. Get creative. I'm only here as a guide. For my artwork, I'm adding a prickly pear cactus. Why? Because they're growing all over the dunes next to the beach. I even picked one, and it picked back. I thought prickly pears had long, sharp spikes, but not the South Carolina variety. Instead, I spent 30 minutes picking tiny fibers out of my poor little fingies. But I got my revenge. I cleaned the fruit, cut it in half, and used it as garnish. Before we dive into line work, let's take a moment to discuss composition. This artwork is Nu Skool, but it could go so much further. Nu Skool thrives on exaggeration, foreshortening, and playing with the flow of the design, like shaping the artwork into a bold S or a C curve. One of the most exciting things about Nu Skool is the freedom to mess with perspective. Imagine seeing the bottom, the front, and the top of the glass all at once. With Nu Skool, that's entirely possible. But don't worry, I'll save that level of craziness for later videos. For me, the most important thing about Nu Skool is readability. If the viewer's brain doesn't recognize what they're looking at within a few seconds, then I feel like I've missed the mark. That said, there's a counterpoint to my perspective. Sometimes the fun of Nu Skool is in the discovery. Letting viewers take a closer look to uncover the mystery of the artwork can be just as rewarding. Now it's time for the line work. Here, I'm making my lines less curvy. I like the look of a line that runs straight and turns at an angle rather than one that's perfectly smooth, but that's just me. If you want to do things nice and smooth and clean, go right ahead, that works. It's your artwork. For my lines, the closer they are to the front, the thicker they are. They taper to a point as they move toward the back, creating a sense of depth. Inside the glass, I'm using magenta tones to illustrate the beverage. As you can see, I've imported a picture of a real prickly pear margarita to color sample from. So it makes a ton of sense to use colored line work to tie everything together. Everything below the surface of the liquid is treated the same, using softer colored lines to match the look and feel of the drink. Lots of spikes here, so let's speed this up for a moment. Finally, time for coloring. Red and green are complementary colors, while green and magenta are considered analogous colors, because magenta and red are in the same color family on the color wheel. I'm using 4 different magenta values, plus a little reddish hue I sampled from the margarita photo. The base color of the beverage itself will be darker than that of the cactus, but the cactus will have more dimension added, which means it'll use a wider range of those values. If that made no sense to you, let's put it this way. I'm making these 2 parts look as different as possible while still relying on the same colors. Maybe I'll make a color wheel explainer video someday. Anyway, just color it in a way that makes sense to you. Have fun. This is where creativity shines. The green next to the magenta is going to make this artwork pop. And that's something important about Nu Skool. It's supposed to be bright, vibrant, and it gets noticed. Here I'm using various green hues. Adding more yellow makes the color lighter and brighter, whereas mixing green with white would only create a dull tint and wouldn't have that wow factor. For the shine on the glass, I'm using the same technique I did in the neo-traditional cocktail tutorial. As a quick refresher, I created a new layer and laid down some white. Then I used my eraser tool with a hard-edged brush to erase lines that follow the shape of the glass itself. Then drop the opacity until the white was just noticeable enough that it still allowed details to show through it. If this is too complicated, don't worry about it. This is an advanced step. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. With Nu Skool artwork, you can get away with having multiple light sources. Here, my main light source, or key light, is from the front, offset slightly to the upper left. So my highlights are closer to that area, while my shadows are positioned on the right, lower sides of all objects. My second light source, called the fill light, is less obvious. It's also from the front and helps keep the front of the objects out of shadow. I'll use this light later to add a shadow coming off the entire piece. But let's not stop there. Light source number 3 comes in the form of a reflection. The light hits the surface of the beverage and reflects the magenta color up on the underside of the parts above the liquid. It's a great way to break up the darker shadowy areas of the artwork and add some extra dimension. I have some extra space to fill, so I'll add a lime wedge. The lime has some very distinct textures, but I'm going to cheat a little. The skin is bumpy and porous, so by adding several green dots and U-shaped highlights, I can give the impression of texture. Only a small portion of the surface is at the right angle to catch highlights, so the dots stay subtle. The same is true for the inner part of the fruit, but this time the texture is longer and radiates from the center. This creates more linear highlights. With all the details in place, the glass, the cactus, the lime wedge, and those vibrant colors, this Nu Skool prickly pear margarita is complete. Remember, Nu Skool is all about exaggeration, bold design choices, and having fun with your artwork. There's no right or wrong, kinda. So don't stress about making it perfect, just make it yours. Thanks for hanging out with me in this third installment in the cocktail series. If you enjoyed this, let me know in the comments what subject matter you'd like to see next. And just a little heads up, the next series will be all about birds. Until then, keep creating, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next video.